is my friend in Australia, James Patterson, at the Australian Television Archive. I think around 2011. Now, he was big into film, and at that time he had a field lens for sale, and I bought it. And so that was our first meeting and acquaintance, you know, halfway around the world. It was sort of an optic part of the field lens. And so a little while later, somebody in Auckland, New Zealand had contacted me about doing a PAL quad job. And I explained to the folks that I didn't have PAL capability, but if they wanted to wait, I would see what I could do. And so I went back to my friend James in Australia. Australia is a PAL country, and so I asked James about it. And he was able to educate me in the PAL standard pretty good. The rudiments, you know, of how it operated. And actually, he mailed me a couple of PAL quad tapes to use for experimentation. And so we bounced a few ideas off each other about PAL quad and what we thought it would take for me to adapt one of my NTSC machines to do PAL. So getting the PAL quads was a real handy thing to have. And a little later on, I became acquainted with Chris Booth over in the UK. Their group is called the VT Old Boys, and they were mostly people from the BBC that had been into the tape at one time or the other. And from Chris, he had acquainted me with a gentleman named Clive McCarthy, who had retired from the BBC. And he was around back in the 60s when the BBC had went, you know, from 625 monochrome to PAL color system, 67. He was there. He saw all that. And he was able to supply me with all the facts and figures and drawings and details on every little thing about how they did that at the BBC in 67. Because at that time they had adopted the PAL standard there. They had converted NTSC machines to do PAL color. 2000 with a 1011 NTSC Colortech. The BBC had came up with a little add-on box which basically took the error from the Colortech and measured it. And if it was above a certain level, then what that meant is that you were on the wrong line. And so I believe they had a flip-flop in there that would advance one line. And of course, the error would drop down to within, normal range. So that's how they would keep it, on the right line, alternate lines, during the burst switching. And Ampex had designed and made some boards for them to use in their 1011s that would allow the 4.43 megahertz subcarrier to pass through unattenuated. So they had adapted their 2000Bs with using the 1011 Colortech and their box that they built at the BBC to switch the burst on alternate lines. And that's what they started out with there, because 1012 Colortech hadn't been built yet. That was a brand new thing in 1967. So Clive was able to educate me about all the PAL changeover that the BBC had done, and of course I duplicated the work here in my shop, on what he had described, and what do you know, it worked. So I was able to do the PAL job for the folks in New Zealand, and that was all well and good, but it didn't really do a whole lot on the head rebuilding front until a little later on. And a few years later, my friend and archivist Shay Drury was struggling with a quad job over in Israel of about 1,000 reels, 1,100 reels, I think, all totaled. He was kind of wrestling with that, trying to figure out a good way to do it, and he wasn't really getting any good answers to his problem either, or I should say any good affordable answers. And so somehow we got together, we met somehow. I don't remember exactly how now, but we found each other, and he had this big quad job that he was wanting to get done, and of all things, PAL 625 and PAL 4.43. So through James and through my work with the folks in New Zealand and studying with the VT Old Boys and Clive McCarthy from the BBC, that had lined me right up to do PAL, and so here was this huge PAL job. And so what that amounted to then was that was a pretty good chunk of money, you know, the payment to do the work for all those tapes. And that gave me the backing, the funding to go do more on the video head work, you know, because I was getting to the point, you know, to where I was ready to start making things, trying things. And of course, to do that, it takes a little bit of funding. So here was this nice big PAL quad job all lined up, and that gave me eventually enough funding, enough money to go and further my pursuits into the tip rebuild, the tip fabricating and the drum